Hi everyone, thanks for joining. We're gonna wait another minute while some people are still logging on. Thank you all for joining us for today's 1099 Prep and Sage Intacct webinar. I just have a few housekeeping notes to go over and then we'll get started. Dougie, can you go to the next slide?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're good. So if you have any questions, just submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom, and we'll try to get to all those at the end of the webinar. Second thing is that your recording and slides of today's webinar will be sent to you after the webinar, so just look out in your email for those. And then if you do want a CPE credit, this webinar can get you 1 CPE credit. So in order to get that, you must answer 3 of the 4 polling questions that will pop up throughout the webinar, complete the survey that will come up after the webinar ends, and stay on for the entire duration of the webinar. And then I will also be sending that in your email, so look out for that. And that's all I got. It's up, Dougie, go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, this is me, the younger version of me. I've been with JMT over 10 years now, and I am here to present to you what's the latest and greatest in processing 1099s in Intacct. So we're going to cover forms. We're going to cover like if you just went live this year and I'm not sure of the setup, we want to make sure that your setup is covered. How do you actually generate the reports? And how can you update data that may be missing? And also we'll end it with some tips and tricks. Just so you guys know, there will be a second 1099 processing webinar at the beginning of January. I believe it's the second week of January. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact date, but if you go to our website, we're jmtconsulting.com and go under events into the webinars section, you'll see where it's a repeat of this session is basically what it is. The other thing I wanted to mention is be sure to, when you're on our website, also check out Innovate in May of 2025. It will be in Nashville this year, where I'm so excited about it. I hope to see a lot of you there. And what we also have a lot of, besides the packed agenda, we have a lot of fun things also planned for the attendees. And for those of you that have gone in the past, you know it'll be jam-packed and your brain will explode with all new details and with all the fun we're having. So without further ado, let's dive into processing 1099s. So first of all, are you ready for 1099? So we're going to cover, this is the basic workflow. You know, you got to make sure that your vendors are set up. You have to make sure that your 1099 accounts payable bills are flagged accordingly. Then you need to make sure that you know how to generate the report so you can verify the data. If there is any data missing, then you can update vendors or transactions, and then you can print forms. There are some changes, though, this year for the 2024 forms. So first of all, I can't stress enough that if you are going to generate forms, that you order those forms from Sage Intacct, and the Sage Intacct tax forms are updated each year by Intacct. And if you buy them from Sage, they already come pre-formatted, so you don't have to worry about formatting and making sure everything aligns. They will aligns. And Sage Intacct makes sure that they are aligned, and they're the only ones that that they support. So if you get forms like from Staples or something else and they don't quite align, it's not going to work. Sage Intacct will not support those. Here's the big change. If you have 10 or more forms to file, the IRS requires that you file electronically. And so just make sure you have that, because some of you have quite a few more than 10 forms to file. You do have to file electronically. You cannot mail those in anymore to the IRS. The other big change in Intacct that's for this 2024 year is that all 1099 forms now support a 2-digit calendar year instead of 4. So you can put in 24 instead of 2024. And these forms that are listed here at the bottom, they no longer include copy C, but instead print copy 1 and copy 2. Okay, so those are the latest updates in Intacct and from the IRS. So let's go to the next one. So where do you get the forms from Intacct? If you're on the Intacct home screen, at the bottom right is this section, the resources section. If you click on checks and supplies, then you'll be able to drill down to the 1099 forms from that. Or if you wish, you can use this direct link that's in this little green box, and you'll be able to also get to the Sage Intacct 1099 forms. So that's the home screen. Okay, so let's make sure that you guys are all set up for 1099s correctly. The first thing you have to do is on the AP configuration screen. So if you're an admin, you have access to this. Not everybody has access to this. It kind of depends on your own internal organization security setup. You have to be in accounts payable. On the accounts payable drop-down menu, you click on the setup tab, you click on configuration, and you scroll down to the 1099 section. There's actually 3 check marks there. The first 2 are the ones that actually enable 1099 functionality. So be sure to check mark enable 1099 flag override and the enable 1099 form and box override. And the reason for that is, well, it not only turns on the 1099 boxes, but some of your vendors have more than one 1099 form, like they may have NEC or miscellaneous, like if it's rent. And you can only set up one default form, and this allows you to not only turn on the functionality, but also to override. Okay. Next, there's the third check mark is the one that the green arrow is pointing to. For those of you coming from MIP, you used to use Atrix in MIP. For those of you coming from other systems, you may have just generated a file. So either way, if you're coming from a software such as MIP, where there's a third-party software, another vendor baked into the system, like Atrix, and using the MIP example, you're used to having that vendor do all the information for you. Well, Intacct does something similar with Tax Bandits. So if you want the option to have Tax Bandits generate your 1099 forms, be sure to check mark this little check mark box. And I'll show you in a few later in the slides how that works and what you can do with it. You don't have to use it. Not at all, but it's a good function of it. All right, so we have accounts payable module configured to do 1099s. Now we have to make sure that the vendor is set up for 299s. 299, sorry, 1099s. How do you do that? So when you set up a brand new vendor, when you add a new vendor, On the additional information screen, if it's a brand new vendor, you will see this 1099 eligible checkmark box. And then when you've entered all the vendor information and you save that vendor, then it'll come up with a pop-up window where you can then tell the system which 1099 form and box should be the default for that vendor. If it's a vendor that requires two forms, you can only pick one default form, but that will not prevent you from assigning a transaction to another form. It's just the default. So pick the one where most of the transactions will come through for that vendor. So that's this scenario. If the vendor is already set up, and once the vendor is set up, let's say you set up the vendor, you send them a W-9 form, and then they send it back, and then you find out that, ooh, they're a 1099 vendor. That 1099 eligible checkmark box will not be visible on the vendor. You will just have to edit the vendor record, go to the additional information tab, and fill in the tag, the 1099 form, the default form. Oops, sorry. And you will also, I didn't catch, oh, here it is. You will also have to fill in the tax ID field. So those are the two that you will have to fill in once a vendor is already set up, and after the fact, you mark them as a 1099 vendor. Okay. And be sure to enter any questions that as they come through, and I will periodically stop and answer the questions. And here is the first polling question. Be sure to fill that out. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out to you is, let me go, the vendor record has on the very first tab, the print as name. The print as name, as you are aware, if you're printing checks for the vendor, is the payable to on the paper check, but it also does double duty as the default 1099 name field. And so if your print as field is the same as the 1099 name, then the 1099 name will be suppressed and the print as field will appear on the 1099 form. However, if the print as name that you see on the first tab it will be populated because it's a required field. And then on the additional information screen, there's also a vendor 1099 name field. If that name field is populated and it's different than the print as field, then the 1099 name field will be first on the 1099 form and the print as name will be second. So they'll both appear, but the 1099 name will be the top name. Okay. So you don't have to fill in the 1099 name field if it's the same as the print as field. You can, but you don't have to. All right. Next, so we have the vendor set up. Now, what about balances? So for those of you that are multi-entity, the first question is, do you need to issue a separate 1099 per entity? If so, and you just went live this year, please make sure on the multi-entity configuration that your multi-entity configuration is set up for issuing a separate 1099 per entity. If you're not sure what that multi-entity configuration is, please reach out to us and we'll make sure with you, we'll show you where that is. Because then you also, and if you have that check mark to issue a separate 1099 per entity, and I'm only talking to those of you that do multi-entity, that have a multi-entity environment, and you're tracking 1099 information by entity. For those of you, also make sure that in the company setting that you have each entity, if you go to company setup and click on entities, that each entity is set up with their own specific tax ID. Okay. So what if after the fact, Hang on, I was just making sure I'm not missing anything. So you have the vendors set up. If you just went live this year, and this only applies to if you just went live on Sage Intacct this year, you also need to make sure that your balances from your old systems were imported into Intacct. Now, if you went live January 1st in 2024, not a problem. You don't have to worry about that because everything was entered into Sage Intacct. But if you went live from February on, we need to make sure that all of your balances are imported. If they have not been, please contact us. Contact me, contact support, contact somebody, and with it at JMT, and we will help you get those balances in. Okay? And we'll help you get those in because they need to be imported at a specific place, and they need to be imported at the top level for those that are multi-entity. Let's go on to the next one. You can also back with the vendors. Each vendor also has a type ID under additional information. You can also flag your 1099 vendors with the type ID of 1099 vendors. And that comes in really handy for reporting purposes. So it just filters out all the other vendors. It's not a requirement, but it comes in very handy. So that's just a little extra screen here. For coming back to the company setup and the tax ID, if you are not multi-entity, if you're a single entity, I know we set you up as multi-entity, but you only have one entity, please make sure that you go to company to the Alt tab or the setup, it's the middle tab, and you click edit and you click the company name, the configure under configuration, and you enter the federal tax ID. And by that, let me show you in Intacct where for both multi-entity or single entity, those fields need to be populated because that's very important. So I'm in my webinars database. I'm going to go to company. So first of all, under the setup tab, under configuration company, if you are a single entity, you're going to click on company and you're going to edit this general information tab, and you need to populate this tax ID field right here. This one right here, that's the one you need to populate. And this one, I would populate both of them. If you are in a state where you also have to file something with the state, this is actually the state tax ID and this is the federal ID. In many cases, those are the same numbers, but go ahead and populate both of them. The address fields right here do not populate. You can if you want to, but they won't print on 1099s. If you scroll down to legal address section, this name field right here, all this will print. That's what prints on the 1099. So make sure that that is populated. Okay. So that's just single entity. For those of you that are multi-entity, you're going to go also to company setup and you're going to click on the word entities. And on those entities that are in the US where you need to, let's do this one, where you need to file separate 1099s, you're going to edit the specific entity. You're going to edit, you're going to make sure that the name is correct. You're going to make sure that the federal ID and the tax ID are populated. The federal ID is the IRS ID. And then you're going to go scroll down to legal contact. You're going to check mark and enable legal name and address on 1099 and 1096 forms. And then you're going to populate these fields. Oops, sorry. These fields. That's what prints on 1099s. Okay. So that's just a formality. Once you have those populated, you won't ever have to do it again unless, of course, you have an address change. So that's what this is. Let's go next. So now, what if you need to make some adjustments? So far, we've got the entity set up with the tax ID and the correct name and legal address. We've got the 1099 functionality enabled on accounts payable. We have the vendors configured for the ones that are 1099 with all their appropriate information. So what if you have some adjustments to make? I think this is out of order. I'm sorry. Yeah, it is. I'm going to come back to that. So let's say you have a vendor now that you've marked as 1099 after the fact. So after you've already written several checks or one or more checks to that vendor, then you find out that's a 1099 vendor. And now you have to edit that vendor record and add the 1099 information after the fact. So you edit the vendor record, you mark them as, whatever the appropriate, whatever the appropriate form and boxes. So this one right here assumes NEC box 1. You want to make sure it's for the correct year, the tax year. In this case, it's 2024. And what you can do is you can either manually type in the total of the transactions that were entered already, or not. You can leave it totally blank, but you can manually update the balances. Here's the other thing that happens is if I enter this information, let me go to the next slide. If I enter this record and this vendor already has some payments made in your system, when you click save, once you've entered that 1099 information, you're going to get a pop-up window that says confirm 1099 updates. And you're going to get two choices. One says update all transactions for this vendor for the current year only based on modified 1099 information. And that is whether you've just added it or whether you changed some information or not. And the other one says update all transactions for this vendor for the current and prior year based on modified 1099 information. So if you wanted to affect last year, like 2023, be sure to select that. Or don't update previous transactions. So what if you just have some new information and now from this point forward, you want all transactions to have the new information, but don't mess with the history. That's when you use the third choice. Most of them will use choice number 1, the door number 1, the very top one. And so what that will do is if you, after the fact, after you've already issued some checks to the vendor, if you now have marked them as a 1099 vendor, or if you make a form or box correction, that will automatically update all transactions that have already previously been entered for this vendor and, posted and paid. That's what that will do. So that's this. So be sure to check the appropriate selection and then click save, and then that'll take care of any changes that you made to the vendor's 1099 record. Or we go here. What if you have so many changes that need to be made? You don't want to do it manually. You have to make corrections, and you have to update transactions for a lot of vendors. So you may or may not have already noticed, but when you have a bill, an accounts payable bill, it's posted, it's paid. Once it's paid, you have the ability to reclassify codes on that bill, right? If assuming the correct security clearance. If you go in and reclassify a paid vendor bill, you can only change the codes. And yeah, you can change the invoice number or the description or the reference, but you cannot change anything to do with 1099s. So let's say you forgot to check mark the box, or you updated the 1099 information on the vendor and selected to not update all the transactions. for a whole number of reasons. But the system will not allow you to edit that transaction and change 1099 information on there once it's been marked as paid. So for that, you do need to be able to use the import templates to make some changes. So if you go to company and the setup tab and you click on import data, as I mentioned up here, in the accounts payable section, there are 3 line items which you can use to update vendor 1099 information. You can use the vendor template to add 1099 tax ID, the form, and the box. The defaults and the vendor, the 1099 name field. So notice the vendor's name has a little asterisk behind it. Whenever you have a row in under import data that has a little asterisk behind it, that means you can update pre-existing records for in this case vendors. Vendors has an asterisk. We can update pre-existing vendor records with appropriate information. What's important there is, so let's say you have a whole bunch of vendors that need to be updated with their 1099 tax ID and with their form and box, and you don't want to do it manually. Well, you download the template and you want to make sure that you only keep those columns in the template that pertain to the 1099 information. So in the case of these vendors, you want to have the vendor ID and maybe the vendor name. You want to have the tax ID. You want to have the form and the box, and potentially the 1099 name field. So you at the most want to keep 6 of the columns. All the rest should be deleted. And there's a whole bunch of them that should be deleted. And the reason you want to delete the fields that do not apply to 1099 information is, for example, addresses. If you leave the address fields in when you make that update, and those address fields are blank, then when you update the 1099 information on a vendor record, it'll wipe out the addresses because the previously imported addresses are now being updated with blanks because you left the blank columns in the file. And so that's why you only want to keep, when you update records such as vendors, you only want to keep the columns in there that will actually update data. You want everything else needs to be deleted. So that's vendors. The transaction update template, that's the one you want to use if you want to update a lot of previously entered transactions with the appropriate 1099 information that's now on the vendor record. So here's a scenario. You've gone live now, and when you went live, you didn't have all the vendor tax ID information in there because we at JMT are not legally allowed to do that. A lot of us we update that information with you guys during the imports training, but a lot of you choose not to do it at that time because you haven't had a chance to pull the information from your old system, or you haven't gotten the information from the vendors yet. So you do it later. So you've gone live now. You have a lot of checks already written, especially like the first month or two, and then you update the vendor 1099. So you need to, once the vendor 1099 information is updated, you need to go back and update all the vendors. Well, you can do that with a vendor transaction update file. And I will show you the template header in just a minute. And the third choice is the vendor 1099 opening balances. That's when you transition from the old system to the new system. So let's say, for example, you went live in October 1. All of your January through September transactions in your old system, you have a lot of 1099 balances already entered in your old system. You need to be able to export those 1099 balances for all of your 1099 vendors that have already been paid with 1099 information. You need to export that. You need to match the vendors to the Intacct vendor IDs, and then they will be imported as vendor 1099 opening balances. And I also have a template, the columns that I will also show you here. Okay, so let's go on to the next screen. On all of them, the field values, they will have like your name, which is the recipient's name, and the type and the form box. So if it's the type NEC, all you have to do is NEC in all caps, or MISC in all caps, and most likely it's box 1 for both. On the vendor upload, so that first file, the template that I showed you, these are the 1099 fields that you need to keep. You also need to keep, obviously, the vendor ID field. Every other column can be deleted or should be deleted. If you want to keep the vendor name for identification purposes, that's fine. But these are the 3 important columns that you want to keep in the template. All the rest, and the vendor ID, and all the rest can be deleted. If it's for this row 2, read row 2, it'll give you the valid values. What I've noticed though is, even like yesterday, if I look at valid values, the template will not include NEC, but it is eligible. You can use it. Just type in NEC in all caps, and that's the form type. Okay, and this is the template to set up the vendor 1099 information initially for the vendor. This one, the vendor open balances. These are the columns for uploading beginning balances. So that's, you've transitioned to Intacct sometime during this year, and you need to bring balances in from your old system to the new system. This is the template that you will use for that purpose. And just to read it, there was just a question that said, so do we actually delete the column from the import template? Yes, you actually delete the column from the import template. Like if I go back here on this one, this is the one where you're updating vendors with their 1099 information. Yes, please delete the columns that you do not need from this template, so you don't accidentally override previously updated data with blanks. Okay, so good question. And this is the vendor open balance. So and even for those, notice it says vendor ID and vendor name and entity. So even if you are a single entity, you only have one entity, because we had to set you up as multi-entity, be sure to include your entity ID, which is that 2-digit code, or some of you have your entity code. Also be sure to designate it as type and the box and the amount. So for example, if you have a vendor that has balances in your old system for form NEC, and that has balances in your old system for form MISC for miscellaneous, you will have 2 line items for that vendor's opening balances, because one is for the NEC form and the box 1, and one is for the miscellaneous form, and whether it's box 1 or 3 or whatever you may have. Okay, that is that. So this one is if you need to update transactions, and this one can be a little bit tricky. So if you need to update transactions and you're not 100% sure what values to put in here, especially this green one. Boy, that was hard for me to say. Sorry about that. Contact us. We'll help you out. So you do have to have the vendor ID. You have to have the vendor name, and you don't have to have the name 1099. That's optional. If you want to have the type and the box, right? Because if we're updating the transactions, it'll pop in the type and the box, or it'll pull from whatever the default is that's on the vendor. The update transaction is the one that's the really tricky one. So for example, read this description on your template. It says the valid values are Y, N, or A, and you're like, okay, what does Y, N, or A mean? And so down here you have, oops, sorry, you have value A. If you selected with value A, it updates all bills and bill lines. So if you have a bill that has 3 distribution lines, 5 distribution lines, it'll update all of it. If it's A with the appropriate type and box. Okay, so that's A. And it'll update all of it as 1099able. That's a new word. Did you know that? If you do value Y, that will only update bills and bill lines that are already marked as 1099able. And so you may be thinking, well, if they're already marked as 1099able, why do I need to update it? Well, what if you accidentally put NEC and it should be miscellaneous? That allows you to change it. And that's why that's there. If you do value N, then it's not going to update any bills. It'll just set up the vendor, the default vendor type and box fields. Okay. Okay. And then you also have to specify the from and the to dates. And that will update any bills that have been entered that apply based on a certain date range that you specify. So let's say you only missed October, but November is okay. Then you only want to put the October date range. That's what that means. So far, so good? You guys are being way too quiet. Okay. The other side note is be sure to answer all your polls. For the vendor 1099 transaction updates, and for those of you using time and expense, it'll also do the employee 1099 transaction updates. Keep in mind that this update file does not create new 1099 records. It only updates existing ones. So it only updates existing accounts payable bills that have already been previously posted or paid. It can also retroactively mark existing transactions as 1099. I can't say that word, sorry, as 1099able for vendors you specify for a given time period, as I just showed you, using the October date range as an example. If you leave, remember I said if you leave the 1099, so for example, if I leave the 1099 default type and box columns in that form, in that template, it will also update the vendor default 1099 form type and box. So it will update the defaults. So just read through this. It will update. You have to be careful with the updates. Yeah, it will. This feature will update builds manually created in Sage Intacct and will only update builds uploaded through the CSV import tool if they had a general ledger impact. So in other words, if the accounts payable bill record posted to the general ledger, then it will update it. And in summary down here, it may look a little confusing, but if you're like, okay, where can I use the 1099 transaction update template and where can I not? So for example, if I imported AP bills or manually entered AP bills that post to the general ledger with no partial payment, that you can update with 1099. And if I imported AP bills that hit the general ledger with manually partial paid, so when you marked it paid within the accounts payable module, you can also update the 1099 transaction information. Where you cannot do this is in some instances when you bring in historical accounts payable bills. So if you went live this year and you brought in historical accounts payable bills, whether they were partially paid or not, you cannot use the 1099 transaction update to update the historical accounts payable bills, which is good because you already have that information in your old system. You don't want to also update it again in Intacct, which, because you're bringing in those balances from your old system, you don't want to also bring in the additional, you're kind of double dipping then. You don't want to do that. So it's a good safeguard. Come on, there we go. What's different for the uploads, like the ones that we just talked about, for the transaction updates, if you leave, for example, the default 1099 type and the default 1099 box blank, on this one template, it will ignore blanks and it will not change the existing data. If you do populate a default type and box, then it'll just update it to the new system. But let's say you want to use this template to clean out what you previously marked as a default 1099 box on form, then you can use this template to mark them out by putting in null in the value. And this again is just it's a bigger type. It's the same explanations of the update transactions in that template within just bigger here. So you can read it better. That's all. And this looks really fun, right? So here it'll tell you, okay, if you have the vendor ID and the vendor name and the name and the update trans, it'll just update the 1099 name. And if you have these columns populated, then it'll also update form type and box. And if you have these fields populated, then it'll mark the transactions as 1099able. That's actually fun to say really fast, etc. That's how this works. Okay, so you can just read through and say, okay, if I have this filled in, what does it do? And that's what these explanations are. And on this, so a question was, which column in the template ties to the vendor master additional information type ID? The only the vendor update template, not the transaction template. The vendor update template or the vendor template has a type ID column in it. So if you wish to update the vendor type ID, you'll use the vendor template and just keep the vendor type field in there. I don't know which column it is because it depends on which ones you've deleted. Okay. All right. So then once all the vendors are in the system, how can you verify that the information is in the system correctly? And there is a vendor view. So if you're on the vendor record, we actually created a vendor view. Let me show you that in Intacct. So if I'm in Intacct and I go to accounts payable and I go to vendors, and I have the old view set up. In this one, I'm not using new functionality. Oh no, this is new one, sorry. If I select, let me go back to the turn off beta. Oh, it doesn't have it. Okay. It'll be here under view. In all of your databases, there's one view called 1099 vendors. Sorry, I don't have it here in this webinar view. It'll say here 1099 vendors. And so that will, let's just do it. Is that 1099? It's just called vendors? Yeah. This one is just called W9 and yours will be it'll be 1099 view, and that'll give you the vendor type ID. So it'll give you the view. Oh, this is a bad example. That'll give you the vendor. I was testing on a different database earlier. Sorry, my bad. It'll give you all the 1099 fields. So at a glance, you can see which vendors have a 1099 data, like tax ID, the form and the box, and which ones don't. That's what that refers to. All right, so how in the world do you print it, and how do you go to reports to run reports? So to generate the 1099 report, you're just going to go to accounts payable under all, the main tab. You go to reports and you select the 1099 report. So and to print the forms, you go to the 1099 forms box. So let's go in Intacct. If you go to accounts payable, at the very top under reports, 1099s, there's 1099 report. And if you scroll down here on the left, there's a whole 1099 section now underneath the checks for e-file submissions, and you can export and you can click print 1096 information or print 1099 form information. If you go to the reports and you select 1099 report, it'll default to the whole year. I'm going to pick 23 data because in this database, I don't have any 24 data. You can select vendors, you can select employees, you can group by vendors and employees. You can tell the system, okay, which forms and types do you want to pull from? So let's say I only want to pull NEC, then I would only select NEC form. The transaction information, you can show all. Like if you want to verify data and you want to see all the transactions for a vendor, so you can verify that every transaction has 1099, is flagged for 1099, you can, or you can just see none. I'm going to just show only 1099. I'm going to click view. It's just very little. My favorite Bugs Bunny. And you can see it'll give you the vendor ID, it'll give you what entity was entered under, what the bill number was, what the GL number was, because I said with detail. And it'll give me the memo line and the bill amount and which form and box it is. And it'll group it by vendor. So if you do detail, it'll show you every single invoice and it'll give you subtotals by vendor. If you show summary, if you run it for summary, it'll give you all summarized balances by vendor, by form and type. I mean, by form and box, sorry. That's the 1099 report. I highly recommend that you run that and verify your data. The export, the e-file, let me show you that one. That is, if I back in Intacct, if I go to 1099 e-file submissions, you click on add and you filter and you tell the system, and it's one e-file per form. And so if you use there's so many 1099 vendors out there where you can go online and all you have to do is create an account with them and then upload the file and they will process the forms for you. And if they will also e-file with the IRS for you, and they will also send out the forms to your vendors if you want them to. That's all your choices. You can do that. You don't have to use Tax Bandits. Okay. You can also use e-file submissions to do that. The other one is if you want to just export the 1099 file to also verify data, like which entity information is going to print on the forms, do the export 1099 file because that will show you everything that's going to print on the 1099 form. And that file can also be uploaded to vendors. I mean, to the 1099 processing vendors. If you need to do a 1099 correction file, you can also do that. This is an old screenshot, but it still applies. If you need to issue a corrected file, you just need to make sure when you generate that file that it's marked as corrected. So you have options, or you can use e-filing powered by Tax Bandits, which means that you can skip the manual printing of 1099 forms and send tax information directly to Tax Bandits. And again, make sure that that's enabled in your accounts payable configuration, which I showed you at the beginning of the webinar. It really is this simple. If you choose e-filing by Tax Bandits, you've got your 1099 vendors, you fix the transactions, you review the 1099s, and then you do have to create a Tax Bandit account just like you would with Atrix or anything else. You do have to, they will validate the 1099 information and then submit and distribute forms, and you do it all from within Intacct. It literally is that easy. So here's a step-by-step on how to get started. You have to subscribe to Sage Cloud Services, which is the same cloud services. Like for those of you that have automatic bank feeds or some of the others, you may already have it. There's no extra charge for that. And that's the go to accounts payable setup configuration and click enable 1099 e-filing powered by Tax Bandits, which I showed you towards the beginning of this webinar. You will have to create a Tax Bandits account and they will charge for filing the forms. Don't ask me how much the charge is. I don't know. I knew it 2 years ago, but I'm sure it's changed. And after you sign into your account, you don't have to sign in again because Intacct will remember it for another 30 days after you sign in. Okay. You can also have multiple users e-filing 1099. So if you have like 2 or 3 people doing 1099 forms, you can do that. Not a problem. So let's go on. And when you e-file, it'll create a batch. I just kept this 2022 file in there because it's still the same process. And it'll tell you within Intacct what the progress is. Like, is it in progress? Is it submitted? Is it failed? Is it whatever? If it's failed, the action will tell you what the issue was. And then we have a whole bunch of frequently asked questions, which I'm not going to go through. I'm going to have you go through that, like how do I update or change 1099 amount for vendor? We just wanted to include them because you're going to get this PowerPoint deck to remind you on how to do it. Okay, so those are the frequently asked questions. A lot of them we already covered in this webinar. This is just a summary of the various questions. And here's some tips. Don't forget to change the year before printing the forms. Like I had to just change it to see 2023. Well, you need to make sure that whichever report you run, that you have the correct tax year. And if I could find and here's some more tips. So now let's go to questions. There are questions. Hang on a second. Okay, so one of the questions was 1099 e-file submission is not an option for them. And be sure to check mark. If I go back to Intacct, make sure you go to accounts payable setup configuration. And assuming you want to do Tax Bandits, you need to make sure that, where is it? It's down here somewhere. I went past it, didn't I? It's that setting that, here we go, that this is checkmarked if you do Tax Bandits. Or if not, then you also need to make sure that in the company admin subscriptions, that Sage Cloud Services is enabled. That's the important one. Sage Cloud is enabled. Okay, you just have to turn that on and click done, and it'll do it. It's also used for bank feeds, but that Sage Cloud Services is necessary for e-filing, especially with Tax Bandits. Okay. And the other one is, oh, this would be for you, Kristen. Can you please confirm when we get the letter confirming attendance and the hour earned? That Kristen would have to answer that. I don't know when Kristen sends that out. And does Tax Bandits offer a discount for Intacct users? They do not. They've already built the integration with Intacct users. It's just the normal. And they will ask you if it's Intacct, so maybe they do, but they don't make it obvious that it's a discount. So you can always ask them. Okay, so I don't know anything about the pricing. So just to reiterate, if you need to turn on Sage Cloud Services, first of all, you have to be an admin in Intacct and have security rights for subscriptions. You go to Company, Admin, Subscriptions, and scroll down to Sage Cloud Services. And that's also in the Power Deck, and turn it on right here. Okay, that's what that is. Okay, is there any more questions? Let me find out. Yes, we will provide the slides as well as the recording of this. Kristen will send it out probably by end of today. We have to wait for the recording to get here from Zoom. And if you need other copies of the slide deck, reach out to me. And do I have my email address here somewhere? Apparently I do not. I do not, sorry. I don't have, it's dstanton@jmtconsulting.com. Most of you know me. And so that's the configuration one. And the Tax Bandits one is you go to Accounts Payable, Setup tab, Accounts Payable configuration, and it's in the same section where you enable 1099 form and box. There's one for Tax Bandits. Question is there a good alternative to Tax Bandits that can handle a large amount of e-file 1099s that works with Sage as well as Tax Bandits does? So Tax Bandits is the only one that's integrated with Intacct. The others, what is it? 10 tax, is it tax 1099? The others are, yeah, the other one that we like to work with is tax 1099, but on that one, you will have to generate the file and then upload the file to them. So and I've had a lot of clients work with tax 1099 and they've been very happy with it. So that's an alternative. Okay. So are there any other questions? Going once? Yeah, going twice. All right. Thank you all very, very much for joining us for this webinar. If you have any questions after the fact and you're not sure about how to do something, please reach out to us and we'll be more than happy to help you. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.